Welcome, everyone, to this, what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating conversation today on music and hate. My name is Amalia Mora, and I am an ethnomusicologist and whose research has looked at the intersection of performance practices and gender-based violence, more specifically, and gender-based hate. And I'm also the research manager for the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate, which is a research initiative founded by Dr. David Myers, which is dedicated to fostering cutting edge and cross-disciplinary research to understand and ultimately, hopefully, mitigate hate. I'm joined today by Dr. Bethan Johnson, who is a postdoctoral researcher whose expertise focuses on terrorism and violent white supremacy. And in August, she will be taking up the position of assistant professor in intelligence and security studies at the Citadel. We're also joined by Dr. Catherine Heather, a postdoctoral fellow in anti-Semitism studies at the Levy Center for Jewish Studies and the Initiative to Study Hate here at UCLA. Her research looks at sonic mediation in Holocaust memory and anti-Semitism on social media. And then finally, last but not least, we are joined by PhD candidate Mukesh Kulriya, a PhD candidate in the Department of Ethnomusicology at UCLA, which is my alma mater as well. And Mukesh works at the intersection of music and religion in South Asia. So thank you, everyone, for joining today. Music sometimes can be romanticized, at least in popular discourse or conversation, as a kind of unifying tool or, a medium for peace and conflict resolution. And of course, we know that it has been used in conflict resolution, but it has also been used both explicitly and implicitly, right, in conflict, violence, and war to propagate hate. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'd like to kick off this conversation with you, Catherine. Um, some of your current research looks at the propagation of hate on social media, right? Specifically on TikTok. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about your research and more specifically, as a musicologist and ethnomusicologist and musician, how music is not only explicitly used to spread hate, like for example, through the sharing of sounds and images that are really easily identifiable as hate, but also more implicitly in the context of social media.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Amalia. Oftentimes, I think a lot of my research is kind of just pointing out the obvious, but when on social media, actually, I think it's not very obvious, actually. It's really kind of festering underneath what we're just casually flipping through. So my current research, as you so well introduced, thank you, really focuses on really sound more broadly. And I like to think of myself more as a sound studies scholar, but used on platforms like TikTok to circulate anti-Semitism, but really just broader forms of hate, because I think that all of the methods that apply to anti-Semitism in processing on TikTok or other social media platforms also manifest in other forms of hate as well. And I think what's particularly urgent is that we have all these kind of AI trackers and modes of mediation for image, some image, but in particular text, but not for sound at all. And so I really have looked at, what exactly are they doing? What is being overlooked? And as you said, there are some instances where there's really direct reference in lyrics that are so explicit. It's so obvious that it's being hateful. For instance, during the election, there was this piece that was being circulated on TikTok using the F word, Kamala Harris, repeatedly, and it was never taken down, and it got millions of views and circulations, and for the other side as well. And so those are really direct references that manifest in these social media spaces. But in other instances too, it can underscore the images or reshape the kind of the tone that is being presented. It could romanticize a concept as well. And so I think that this is in particular the danger, is because we're just not users aren't necessarily paying attention, or it might have a past historical implication that they're just not aware of. And I know some of this connects with Bethan's research as well, but some of what I look at, of course, like ties to Nazi Germany. One of the really what actually got me looking at TikTok was a student brought in this TikTok that used the piece Erica, which was composed by Herms Neal during Nazi Germany. It was really, really popular, and it was a marching song post World War II. It became a sort of like soundscape to curate what Nazi Germany was like. It was used in the 1959 film The Diary of Anne Frank with the marching Nazis. It was in Schindler's List. It's been in numerous films to accompany Nazism. But then, like 4 years ago, it started to appear on TikTok as well as just kind of accompanying basic Germanness. There'll be a German Shepherd. But then also people who knew the origins of it started to associate it with things like there was this video of someone exterminating cockroaches in their shower. And the first time they uploaded it with no music whatsoever, and then a user commented, re-upload with the song Erica. So that's very, very, in particular, that's anti-Semitic in nature. They know the origins with that. And so kind of highlighting those, what are the implications behind that? How is this manifesting, and the dangers behind that. So that's, some really direct elements. But then there are some too that really don't have anything to do with it. Like one thing I showed in our meeting about a month ago, but Zelensky's visit to the White House, and they just miniaturized him, and then they accompanied him with this ridiculous classical music sounding to just really make it just a ridiculous kind of presentation overall. And so I think in that kind of element, you have that affective notion of the music accompanied with the imagery as well.
Thank you so much. And you brought up something I know we've talked about before, but you brought up Kamala Harris and how you also were looking at the, pronunciation of her name and rather the mispronunciation of her name. And as you noted, your research has looked at not just music, but also sound more generally, and including dialect and pronunciation and how both can really be weaponized to propagate hate. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and specifically maybe, your thoughts about the Kamala campaign.
Yeah, I was really thinking about this a lot during the campaign in particular. I mean, there's so many times that the opposite side would mispronounce her name intentionally. How we're receiving dialect, just in general, that shapes our perceptions of individuals. And I know even online too, we have some researchers at the center that are studying this, like Black dialect is translated and data sets as well. But we hear this in real time too in our country. And I've been thinking about this a lot more at present too, as we just had our executive order, making English the official language. And what does that say about our country? It's not just a policy shift, it really is a sonic one. It's legislating a singular sound and what that's supposed to sound like within our country. It's removing all these other elements from it as well. And so just, really training how we're supposed to frame our kind of sonic consciousness within our environment.
And I wanted to jump in on that a little bit as well, to think about even the concept of what is English, what does codifying in law, the idea of English as the language of the United States. So the concept, which Catherine was mentioning as well, of racists abusing, critiquing, and characterizing AAVE, so African American Vernacular English. African American Vernacular English is an American version of English. I don't think that's what, for instance, this White House means when it's trying to codify English into the language of the country, nor do many of the anti-Black racists who have supported the current administration, would they be thrilled by or view that as an acceptable form of speaking English? And so I see quite frequently in not just videos, but also even in the written word, mocking of the use of AAVE, or even the sort of heightening of that to essentially create the idea that Black Americans don't know how to speak English, which is then extended to mean that they are not intellectually as intelligent and are intellectually inferior to white Americans or white peoples. So I think that there's that component as well. There's also the general targeting of the way that non-native speakers speak English, and the idea that their struggle to speak a second language is somehow indicative of anything about their intellectual inferiority rather than the fact that they are speaking or able to speak two languages, if not more, as compared to one. But in racist discussions online and in person, I see quite frequently this manipulation of dialect and sort of what they consider to be skilled or unskilled mastery of the English language as a way to prop up white supremacy.
I think the topic of language is a really great segue into uh, you, Mukesh, and your research, which explores how music in the Indian context that is not necessarily explicitly hateful against a particular group can nonetheless be used to spread hate. For example, when it's used in a particular context, and if it's with music and lyrics in particular, if it's performed in a specific language, right? So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how this works. And also, if you could give us just a brief background about the current political climate in India and more specifically right-wing Hindu nationalism that some of our listeners might not be as familiar with.
I think when we speak about right-wing politics across the globe, historically, I think it's always been the purity is something which is at the center of it. Whether it's a purity of the race, purity of the language, purity of musical form or dance
Mhm.
form, cultural practice, food, and I think specifically in context of India, which is like where the system of caste is something very, very entrenched. Caste is broadly worked on the question of purity and impurity. And in on the question of music and contemporary political environment in India, I think during the course of my ISH research and the podcast which just got released last week, I think there is a lot of interesting insight that in India, I think the right wing populism, right wing politics and music's relations goes at least 200 years back, and we can be it can be traced at least from 1810-11 onwards. And so one thing, there is a very clear cut hate music, like the lyrics will be laced with hateful remarks against a particular caste, a particular religious minority, or any religious group, or sometimes gender as well. So that's a longer history, and these we can say these are explicitly hate music, right? And the second, when you have a question of contestation between language, when one language is part of your identity, another language comes as homogenizing force from the top, that language itself become a tool of oppression, and anything said and spoken or even written in that language become kind of a hate, or just a visual or a kind of auditory presence of that particular language could be a incitement of violence. So in that way, I think the first part is quite easy, explicitly hate music. It's the second part which becomes much more important, and I think during the course of my research we spoke about, I think, the loudness, the whole idea. People might not necessarily have issue with the kind of music you play, even the context that you play, but the sheer decibel. Like I think in a couple of months back, in one instance is in Jaipur and in one instance is in another city of Indore, there was a cases of violence because of music, and it was not intercommunal or Hindu Muslims. It belongs to the same religious identity, but just because the place, someone was living in the neighborhood of a temple where the music was being played, and they got really tired of this loud music. So people go and say, oh, you don't play this music because it's too loud, would necessarily incite violence because they say you are against our music. Where this hour is the same thing. The perpetrator and the kind of the people who were victim in this case belong to the same religious identity. In fact, they share the same political belief. But just the fact it becomes so sensitive that you say anything against playing music, you could be branded as other. I mean,
Mm.
it's funny that the guy who was accused was the one who put the seed money or the initial sum money to actually start that temple, and his family was kind of a caretaker living right next to it. So you see how the other is formed in
Mm.
just a moment, it, and we are not talking about it kind of invisibilizing the long history. We are talking about this immediate local history of that particular family and that temple. It's the important part. I think it would be important for us to understand in an Indian context when we speak about the music or hit music. It's about street power, and a majority of people in India from the marginalized caste, they have always on the receiving end of the state, whether it's a colonial state or the post-colonial state, and their access to public spaces in any form is always under threat. They always go out in public space in fear, and these high music procession are kind of the only places or one of the very few places where these people feel empowered on the street, and they think that being part of this procession make them feel like kind of a equal in whatever way we can contest that idea of equal. But these are some of the places where actually they feel like they have also presence, they are kind of legit presence on the street. And
Mm.
that's where the larger mobilization of the marginalized caste around these procession and this music is, and that's the evidence because they think these are the very 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 few spaces we could be there, and that the police would not be threat for them. In fact, police in a lot of cases might be there to protect them, even to, so that sense that they could be closer to power in any sense, their presence is something which is very tempting. And I mean, we have to put them, instead of marking them, oh, these are the, like, right wing people, hateful, if we have to understand the longer history of their own relationship with the state and power.
I was actually thinking a lot about the public consumption and who is included in an audience, or when actually in the context of music, you can actually sort of speak out at two levels, or address issues differently to different audiences. And the context I'm thinking of most recently is in the United States. The Super Bowl has a halftime show every year, and there's a lot of sort of, even within the music industry, the politics of who is selected to perform at the Super Bowl is a large thing. Not just the singing of the national anthem, but that actual halftime show, it is quite a thing. And this year, Kendrick Lamar performed. He is a Black rapper from here on the West Coast, and he had a really significant, and what many people said was like overtly political and subsequently very politicized Super Bowl halftime performance. And so again, as I look at white supremacists, there was a lot of discussion around why he was selected and what that meant, especially given that the president was there in attendance, and there was discussion with Samuel L. Jackson talking about sort of performative Blackness and performativity, and who was going to do what. He, at one point, I think the line was "to ghetto" was used in the description from Samuel L. Jackson, who was Uncle Sam in itself, and that switched the kind of nature of the songs that Kendrick Lamar was singing to a different kind of audience, to appeal to a different kind of audience for a time before returning elsewhere. And so I was thinking about who was included in and felt included or excluded in what ways. And so there was a lot of discussion online from the communities that I study, white supremacists, saying this was like clearly an inferior performance. You couldn't understand what he was saying. Like it wasn't accessible to the kind of audience who watches the Super Bowl. Any number of things, but that concept again of like AAVE and also like the Black experience and having that through song expressed at this sporting event was highly criticized by white supremacists. At the same time, you had other individuals who noted, for instance, Kendrick Lamar had to bleep some of his lyrics out or censor his lyrics, which include the use of the N-word, which he as a Black man is widely considered. There's like the politicization of whether or not that's okay to say in music or not, who can say it, who can sing it, who cannot, and whether or not the Super Bowl should have bleeped those things or censored them or not, was also part of the discussion around what makes an acceptable performance or acceptable to whom in the musical sense. But I was thinking a lot about that concept of even when unified in watching that Super Bowl performance, which was meant to address many different communities who all wanted to see artistry at its highest form. People accessed that differently, criticized that for different reasons, loved it for a great number of reasons as well. I'm a huge K-Dot fan, so I really enjoyed it. But like that was really fascinating to me. And that was politics and music combined. And not just politics with kind of like the big P in terms of liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, but sort of day-to-day racial politics and the politics of music are all kind of playing out on stage, and the performance played into that in many ways. And it, I think, started some really interesting conversations in many different communities. But it was something that I was thinking about, this idea of like access to power and inclusion, exclusion, and people's responses to that, their sensitivities to how music and when music is played, to Mukesh's point.
Yeah, and if I can just kind of piggyback off of that a little bit, we also saw a very much afterlife of that performance manifest on social media too, and kind of pulling back to what I was talking about and how, you know, the music is used in kind of hateful ways that we don't necessarily think that it can be used for, but, you know, we're taking on people responding in a very positive way, and they are also, you know, supporters of his music, and so they're taking the Not Like Us and remaking it in TikToks and supporting it and saying, oh, we really loved what you did at this halftime show. But on the other side of it, we have the protests, the people that Bethan was noting really didn't like it. And so they're taking this music and presenting it on TikTok in these ways that is actually very, very hateful and derogatory. And so now we have it even more viral in these social media realms. And so it takes on an entirely new afterlife that no one could have actually predicted in really, really strange ways. And it's still continuing actually too. And the weird thing about social media then is it has transferred globally as well. And to see how this kind of American predicament is now manifesting globally in this political rhetoric too. Yeah.
Thank you so much for saying that, Catherine, because I was literally just thinking, you know, or I was going to ask Bethan or, you know, everyone here actually, like how, if that has sort of resonated or, you know, been picked up internationally, sort of on a global scale, because I know, you know, Bethan, your work specifically looks at white supremacism as like a global movement that kind of is boundaryless. And so I was wondering if you could actually kind of talk about that, like how the spread of hate through music and how it is a kind of global, unfortunately, movement that transcends nations.
Yeah, so I think that that's actually a really helpful way of considering that, right, the Super Bowl performance or any Super Bowl performance has a national audience, but also an international audience. And a lot of the comparisons actually from white supremacists who were saying this is like rap isn't real music, it's inferior, any number of things. Oftentimes, those individuals, if they were based in the United States, let's say, would cite examples of superior white music that were from other countries overseas. So often it's classical music. Wagner is a big favorite, but like orchestral music, piano performances from outside of the United States, though at times also from inside of it. But I thought that was really indicative as well, that it was contrasting different time zones and genres, but also artists from different communities as examples of when like why white music was superior to non-white music. But I look at white supremacy, particularly violent and sort of terroristic white supremacy, because I want to acknowledge that there's like many different iterations of white supremacy that can be caked into the way that a state is organized, the way that society structures itself, any number of things. But I look at really overt, aggressive, often physically manifested iterations of violent white supremacy, and how that intersects with music is often through really aggressive, at times overtly inciting music. So music designed to incite individuals to acts of violence, be that terroristic attacks, hate crimes, vandalism that induces fear in others. So there's lots of different ways that I deal with the proliferation of that music and those messages. But I think it's important we have so much technology that allows us to access artists and bands from all around the world. So what might have been generations ago like a hateful band that played in your local pub is now able to, through radio, through CD, through streaming services, you're able to hear that anywhere in the world. And so when I look at white supremacist music, I am listening to music that is coming from all across the world, from individuals who are marketing themselves as sort of global bands, yes, that are based originally in a certain country, but that are marketing themselves internationally very frequently, who are attending and playing in certain cases in sort of music festivals overseas, and who will sing at times in their native language, but also in other languages that are more consumer friendly, or for them more consumer friendly. So there is a kind of boundlessness. I mean, within the white experience, they're not trying to appeal to non-white audiences usually to that music, and it does spread. And it's designed to spread and speak to different generations, different demographics, different geographies.
I'm wondering where hate speech laws come into this, because obviously different countries have hate, like in Europe, correct me if I'm wrong, hate speech is banned. So how does that work in terms of the cross-pollination of this music?
Yeah, so European laws are all very unique and different. They have more stringent laws regarding what might be defined as hate speech or hateful speech. I want to make really clear, it's not this concept that has currently been floating around in the ether that like free speech doesn't exist in other countries, and that like somehow the United States is a denizen of free speech in a world that is against it. I want to make really clear that I don't believe that to be the case. But you are correct. There are countries in which, for instance, like a musical performance or a CD cover that includes someone Sikhiling might be banned in certain countries as part of the performance. Or so there's those components. There's also legislation in many countries. Again, there's nuances in them, which prohibit not just hate speech, but speech that is designed to incite hate and violent action. in other people. So it is not just that, for instance, a band may use a racial or ethnic slur or religious slur, but their music may actually, their lyrics may entirely avoid a slur, but call upon the audience to go out and engage in violence against a minority community. So instead of using a slur, they may use terms like invader or Black and brown person, or a communist is frequently a refrain. None of which are technically slurs, but it's part of in the lyrics, it's go attack these people, go engage in violence. And you're hearing that play and then a sort of chorus literally over and over again in your head. And so that in certain countries can be investigated or prosecuted even as an incitement to violence. For those who are producing or propagating that. It can also at times escalate to the nature of sort of terrorist materials if there's terroristic threats that are seen as like an immediate threat to life. But again, there's a lot of nuances with music because I think that there is a discussion and a desire in many places to allow people artistic license, let's say, or creative license to express their beliefs. However, in many countries, the lenience or that which is allowed within the scope of artistic license is curtailed for the sake of public safety or like the fact that there are threatening language within that. So there's a lot of issues with the legality of these questions because you're right, these are boundaryless things in many ways. So that which may be produced in one country is illegal in another country. And I would say music producers are of the sort of white power, white extremist movements are very cautious around where they produce this music, where they host concerts, where they might even ship CDs and other things. But it is really difficult to entirely silence, to use a musical term or an auditory term, the existence of those hateful things in a country if you can like go online and go on the radio and listen to hate music from somewhere else, and then hold your hands up and say, I don't own it, I don't see, like, I didn't make it, and just listen.
I'm wondering for all of you, actually, because I think we're talking about several different pieces here. There's the use of music in the recruitment, right, of potential people who could be, part of a hate movement. There's the inciting of violence piece that you mentioned, right, Bethan? And I'm wondering if in the recruitment piece, if you all have found in your research that more explicit hate is more effective in the recruitment or more implicit sort of ways of brainwashing or recruiting. Because certainly I can understand like certain phrases, right, that are more subtle or that are dog whistles. Like people will be able to recognize these certain things in the movement, right? As like, okay, go out and commit an act of violence because I know that, and as an insider, I'm being encouraged to do that. But what about in the kind of recruitment process or brainwashing?
Yeah, I think, may I go?
Please.
Yeah, I think what Bethan actually said was resonant quite a lot in India, because in India there is no law in such as on hate speech. You could have hate speech, but if it doesn't lead to violence, legally you can't be prosecuted. But in a lot of cases, as you know, the kind of the way they very smartly work, and there's a longer history. I think there's a book came recently, H-pop, Hindutva pop, and before there's a numerous long scholarship journalistic work that a procession would go, and they would go in front of mosque or maybe Muslim areas, or let's say other caste areas, and just passing through the particular area could be a cause of violence, or they would make it a point to stay there and play loud music and dance, and sometimes those music would be hateful, a lot of time just the music itself, right? So in that case, the procession would go because there is a police security. But lot of time it happens that when the procession is coming back, you know, because it's over now, the people are coming back. There are a lot of time instances of violence has happened because then people are so charged with that, right? So you can't directly connect. Okay, the procession was over at 9, but it happened at 9:30. So how do you make a connection? But there's a lot of, there's a lot of connection right there if you want to look at it. So which brings to this question of, like, the question of how certain violences can happen, and, like, so I think the state plays very important role when you are discussing about the Super Bowl uh, context. And one thing it reminded me of that, Maharashtra is one of the biggest state in India, which is capital city Mumbai, which is also the capital of entertainment industry. They have a oath taking ceremony last a few months back, I think last year. And in the oath taking ceremony of the chief minister, a very popular Hindutva pop singer sang, like, on the stage, where all these celebrities, film stars, and some of them are Muslim, were right present there. And so these are like of a kind of a very validating spaces for these singers. And when they came here, that's where the recruitment things work, because when they say they are not fringe, they are not like a small figure, now they become an important figure for recruitment, political mobilization, and a lot of time they work as kind of a mediator between the different power groups. And because their photos on with big chief big political leader, business leader on big platform are kind of thrown around on social media, they become a kind of a venerated figure, and that's where draw their followers, and a lot of cases recruitment drive. And that's where they kind of they kind of become a person who has connection to all the right kind of people. And second, I think in Indian context is important. In last few years, the Hindi film industry, which we call Bollywood, is really struggling, right? So there's a huge vacuum in the consumption of music. And unfortunately, if you see in India, there's a lot of popular music industry, but especially in North India, Hindi film industry is a big industry, but there's no independent Hindi music scene, right? So there's a lot of space there where there's a lot of content coming from the regional areas, and the production of this is happening, like, kind of in very informal ways. So someone would record a song and put it on social media, and then it will be taken off, someone else would take it. In terms of reels and shorts, it get really overnight very popular. So it kind of easy to kind of go under the radar, but it's very easy to circulate as well. So it's kind of where work, it's like the sheer scale and the decentralization of production and circulation and consumption, everything. That's where the figure become important, and that's why the having these people performed at these big stage, having photograph clicked and circulated with the right kind of people, draw a lot of people, like, and because they say, oh, this person is good, important. And now they also kind of started entering into the religious traditional spaces, where they would be like spiritual spaces, they would be singing about God, like, all through the night, very spiritual, peaceful kind of spaces. That music and musicians are coming there as well. So there is a lot of kind of the question of legitimacy, really, because they get the crowd to kind of get their follower there.
And I
I have a
think
question. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was thinking this issue of also what is violence might be helpful for us to consider, not to get overly scholarly, but right, there's lots of different definitions of what constitutes violence. We often think of it as, for instance, sort of physically manifested. I hit you, I slap you, I shoot you, those kinds of things. But actually, assaultive violence can be the threat of someone doing any of those things. Or you can think about it much more like, could you imagine if every day around you there were individuals who were listening to music that made them perhaps prone to engage in violence towards you. You would never know where the threat may come from. It's sort of all consuming and surrounding in that way. So I think the idea of like violence can be enacted in different ways. It can manifest, like you said, in a time scale where there may be a lapse therein. So I think there's kind of a banality to that violence. So we talk about banal nationalism, but I think there's also kind of banal forms of violence. And music helps feed that in many different ways. And certainly there are examples about music helping actually be the soundtrack to individuals as they prepare to engage in manifested violence, as well as like as they sort of as the backtrack as they engage in other forms of hate. I think of it as kind of a cocoon or a soundscape that surrounds them and normalizes what they're doing, whatever that version of hate might be. But to the point that Mukesh had about the decentralization, I think it's really fascinating. And I think Catherine does, when looking at TikTok and other things, kind of decentralized music and hate. I often look at it from the alternative perspective in the right wing, which is like there are really sort of concretized, what I like have been calling the enterprise of extremism. It's financially very lucrative for the white power music scene, which is often another term kind of used synonymously with white supremacist music scene. And so you can make hundreds of thousands of euros for a single festival held in one weekend in Europe, for instance, which is then used not just to pay the bands and to pay the like venue and other things, but it is being invested in the purchase of any number of other things. So music is actually being used to gain capital, which may have implications for violence in the future, but certainly also makes the community where these music events are hosted feel threatened. So there may not actually be explicit violence going on at that moment, but fear of violence is very real for the communities where a musical event may take place or where that music is being blared. But it's also very lucrative because it is not totally centralized in the white power scene or the white supremacist scene, but there are major music labels, music producers, bands that make lots of money, like platforms that will advertise them or host their music. And so it's a major cash cow, for lack of a better term, for many in that scene. And so that's part of also what this does. And it, I would argue, is a very dangerous element that we're not taking as much, we're not focusing as much on, which is like using music to make money and then in the future use that money towards really dangerous, potentially overtly violent ends, or to use it to purchase land, to create white-only spaces, or to engage in any number of other things that are actual on the grounds violence, but that have that, like Mukesh said, time gap involved. So you might not be able to say like, oh, this music festival caused this act, but in fact, they are connected. We just don't have the attention span to note that, or the immediacy that one might like for a prosecutorial threshold, let's say.
Just I think just to add on that, I think this is totally, I think, in agreement I am, because this is all centralized, decentralized, also the sheer scale of India's diversity, because you need different, very localized language. The vernacular actually also plays very important. A lot of vernacular language don't have their own content, but in this kind of content production, you have very hyper localized languages also being catered to like a small group of people, and these are decentralized. But one goes down, then the other comes up. So this is very well founded, connected system, production houses, and I mean there's a capital flow, and the capital flow goes to people, individuals, organizations, in terms of donation. And a lot of these singers are also becoming very popular, and they are running for offices directly themselves. Just by being a singer, the kind of capital they draw, the popularity, social media, lot of them are running to office, so much so that even the one of the most popular devotional music singer, spiritual, devotional traditional music singer, they are turning to these genre because there's so much money and power in that. So that's where it's not only the hate music, the kind of traditional music which used to counter hate or bring people together historically. The singer of those traditions are turning to this music because there's so much power and money and everything in it. So I think, yeah.
Wow. Wow, Catherine, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of circle back. I really love that Bethan brought up the question of what is violence, because also thinking back to your initial question, Amalia, on recruitment, I don't think necessarily we're getting a sort of direct recruitment that is being pulled out of social media and what I'm looking at in my research. But I do think kind of this larger question is like, what are we actually training our minds to be okay with? And a lot of it too, I think about like FOMO, essentially, like what are our kids like recreating? What are they okay with sharing? And I do see a lot of people just sharing these really awful videos, but that maybe if they just actually stopped and thought for a minute at how bad it actually was, they might not actually share it. But this has just been increasing and increasing and increasing since I started this research 4 years ago. And so, what is this violence? Is this one video with this kind of, seemingly mundane soundtrack, like that Zelensky video that I brought up? Like, is that actually harmful in and of itself on its own? But then when you couple it with a series of other videos over and over and over again, I think that is what the danger is. And then if we're shaping our minds to be okay with this, and then we take it into real life, and I think right now too, we're really framing what we're taking on social media, especially the youth, more so into our everyday lives. We're really seeing that manifest. And so I think that is a kind of mundane recruitment in a sense, that we're just okay with this now. And I think we're also seeing this shift even in entertainment. I mean, you have like the Amazon The Boys, where you have this really gruesome, violent scenes with like Hava Nagila. And so you have this weird juxtaposition of music with violent imagery, and people just sit there and laugh with it. So I think, yeah, what are we training our brains to be okay with, essentially?
And I wanted to just raise another point, which is like this issue of recruitment and sort of very recognizable versus more covert or implicit versions. Obviously, I look very frequently at very explicit lyrics and performances, but think about it like you would perhaps I don't know how much people actually look at a whole CD, but right, you have singles versus like the breadth of the CD, which sometimes has like just a different vibe to it. And so at times I will see the sort of song that gets someone interested in a band may not be even the song that they're most popular for, but a song that addresses often there's a lot of discussion in my circles around the recruitment of young boys and young men. So songs that are either sort of tragic, unrequited love songs, or songs that are designed to speak to their sense of angst at not feeling understood. Not every single song that a hateful band plays may be designed to speak to the kind of hate that the rest of their music does, but actually bands often, they are, for whatever we think of the product, they're artists, and so they can speak to lots of different elements of the human experience. And so there will be songs on an album that I would classify as a hate album that don't actually deal with the other at all, but deal with feelings of disillusionment, loss, self-esteem issues and other things that can speak to someone, draw them in. And then when you go to listen to the rest of the album, you're hearing an escalation of that language, or a song that may say you're feeling disillusioned and misunderstood. And then you go to the next song that then explains why you feel that way. And that explanation is because democracy is wrong, women don't understand you, racial others are taking over from you. So it's not always that like every single song that a hate band as defined plays has such aggressive lyrics or a music video or other things. It can be that they kind of literally lull someone into listening to them, and then like eventually they graduate to more extreme songs. I also think like any auditory experience of like an album or a discography, like these people are listening to music that is hateful throughout their day. So it's not that every single time they turn on their radio, what they want to hear is the most like hardcore, intense, pro-violent music. They want a soundtrack to their life just the same as anyone else. The bands that I look at often try to create like a whole experience so that people don't venture outside to look by non-white audience or by non-white artists, or that promote anti-white messages. So they'll produce songs that help you they think will help someone fall asleep, or that are love songs, or that are sort of patriotic songs, things that they can play at a family gathering. There's a lot of like Christmas music or Christian identity music. I look a lot more recently at like music you can play with your children, which I would never play with any children around, but because I know where like the bands that are producing them, not because the music itself is telling like 3 or 4-year-olds to go engage in violence. It's just like Catherine said, sort of priming people to get there. And again, this concept of a kind of soundtrack to your whole life, these hate bands, some of them will spend their whole careers just producing really thrasher, heavy metal, violent stuff, but often they have a whole panoply of songs that speak to the whole experience, so that they can induce people in, but also keep people and keep people's interest regardless of the mood or the time of year or the kind of song they want to listen to. So I think that's really important as well, because I think there is a misunderstanding when anyone is talking about hateful music or music that perpetuates hate, that it's always the most like screamo, intense thing.
And just, I know Mukesh had his hand up, but just to kind of, as an example for that, like Erica, the song that I mentioned at the very beginning, it's not a hate, like when you listen to it, it's not rageful and horrible sounding. And honestly, TikTokers will comment on things like, chill, it's just a song about a flower. But actually, like if you know the origins and the ideology behind Nazism, it's not just a song about a flower. It's about a white couple getting together and then having a white child. You know, that ideology is intertwined within the lyrics, and then it's conveyed in this really beautiful package. So exactly as Bethan was saying, you know, you have the whole thing all together and presented so that you have all aspects of it in different ways.
Yeah, thank you. And Mukesh, I know you wanted to jump in, and I was just going to actually, maybe in what you're about to say, you can incorporate just a question that I have that Bethan and Catherine made me think of, which is in Hindu pop, is it what makes it more right-wing than, let's say, any Hindu devotional or Hindu pop music? What makes it more right-wing? Is it like explicit lyrics that are a little like pro Modi, or or is it of the more subtle variety, like what Bethan or Catherine are talking about, wherein it's seemingly something very benign, but just the mere fact that it's, or is there something musical that indexes that right-wingism?
Yeah, I think I just to add to the last point that Beth and Catherine made, I think the whole point of this is being accumulative. That this otherization, violence, it's an accumulative. It's intergenerational. It's part of upbringing, socialization, schooling, larger value system, and I think a lot of time music, because we are discussing particularly about it, plays an important role. It could be a catalyst at some point of time, like in a constant consumption of certain kind of music would normalize a certain kind of otherization of people. you might not indulge in act of violence, and you might, but at some point of time, some inflection point, you might feel, enraged enough to kind of take up violence. And your question about what is particular to H-pop, I think it is not about Narendra Modi per se, because it's a longer history. The use of music in India for hate is has a much longer history. So now we see, because of the technological advancement, we see the proliferation and very versatile, a very aggressive use of it. But in history of India, I think even 70s, 60s, 70s onwards, right wing has always been more adaptive to technology. If we look at 70s and 80s, the videos, cassettes, all of them, like in the 1980s, the movement for the Ram Janmabhoomi, to build a temple in Ayodhya, they were circulating video of like hate speeches in their contraband from all over the place. Songs, they were popular even before the recording industry came. Even the print in the procession, they used to this music. So one of the central theme that make it distinct from other music is it has a very strong anti-Muslim rhetoric. That is a very characteristic of, I would say, this genre of song. They might come in a different form, but that's something very central. Sometimes it could be very explicit, sometimes it would be very implicit. And second, H-pop, as we understand, because in a popular form, it is a high beat music. A lot of time the music would overtake the lyrics. So it works both ways. Sometimes the lyrics might not be that explicit, but the music would do the job, because in the particular context it is being played in certain procession, political rally or religious procession, or in a cases of maybe violences. Second, lot of time a very very explicit music, lyrics would basically be kind of covered with this loud music, so they would go get popular, but a lot of time people might not notice it. So it works. Music could cover the explicit and implicit both way, but it's actually the music which actually bring people together. There's hysteria, people come together, dance, and there's a sense, that energy that they makes there. That's what is more kind of central, I think. So apart from, I'm not a right person to speak on the musical quality of what makes it distinct from other, because I think more or less it's auto-tuned music, lyrics mostly would speak about, like, let's say India, Pakistan, Kashmir, or let's say anti-Muslim rhetoric, or temple and mosque, or or a lot of time there's a political content, in the sense if there is a political issue coming up, they would kind of prepare a ground to kind of make an opinion about that, like so they're also working to prepare a certain ground, kind of educating people of their own worldview. So kind of, as like a lot of people say, building consensus about things which is ideologically core to them, taking up particular narrative. So I think these are the way that I think I would personally think in my study of these things. That's what make it more kind of characteristically anti-Muslim, that makes it more core of Hindutva pop. And then lot of time it will also comes up in a very inclusive way also, like it is all not about divide, it's also bringing people together.
I wanted to speak to that point around lyrics for a second, because I find it fascinating, Mukesh, that you brought that up, because one of the elements that I often look at is within certain movements or white power music scene, you have like black metal, death metal, heavy, really loud sound, and sometimes it can be really difficult, especially for the untrained ear, to like understand what the lyrics themselves actually are. And I was always wondering when I started this, I would wonder why you would do that. If you were going to write lyrics to something, why make them essentially impenetrable? Or how popular lyrics were, or bands were singing in languages that their audience didn't speak. I was like, what is this? And what I've come to consider is the fact that when you are listening to a song, let's say that has a beat that you really enjoy or a certain sound to it, you'll go and look up the lyrics if you want to sing along or you're just like curious. So then you not only have the auditory experience, but you're reading the lyrics, having already been interested and kind of hooked in by the sound. And so if you like that sound, you may be emotionally primed to accept some of the rhetoric that is being discussed in the lyrics, or it may be sort of normalized to you already, but you are now also potentially online Googling that event if it's the element of that, or you're finding other songs within the genre that bespeak that same person or place or thing. And so you're educating yourself often through a very biased lens towards that. And so the lyrics actually can be more purposeful when they are harder to understand because it requires that extra step from the audience to like go ahead and look it up and then fall down potentially a very warped rabbit hole and then feel okay singing it. Or if it's kind of muffled, people find themselves kind of humming and singing along, not realizing that that's sort of what's going on until they go look it up. But I was always fascinated by that component. And I think that those are it's not just because if you make your songs really hard to hear, it's harder to prosecute you because you're like, is that actually what the lyrics say? But because it forces your audience to actually engage in a kind of participatory musical experience of looking up your lyrics and then going from there. And so I think that that is important to consider. And I hadn't connected it, Mukesh, with your line of work as well, but I find that very frequently. And over time, you get better at, like, if you follow the band well, you'll like learn how the singer sings something. Or if you know the genre well, you might be more able to hear things clearly the first time, which again is a sort of in-group, out-group way of being like, yeah, no, I'm part of this scene because I understand the lyrics without having to look them up. But at the same time, it's inducing you, it's sort of hooking you in with the sound or the beat, and then forcing you to buy in by like going to look up what it says, and then forcing you to think about it again. And when you think about it in the future, every time you listen to that song, you're now thinking not just, oh, that beat sounds interesting, but you're thinking about that event and it's becoming associated with something that you enjoyed listening to or you were curious enough listening to. So it tethers you emotionally and intellectually.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting theme that we're touching upon, which is really the power of the sort of more implicit kinds of ways that music spreads hate. And a couple of things that all of you have said made me think about, Dr. Kathleen Blee, who is a sociologist who is an expert she's been studying white supremacist movements for decades. And one thing that she said when she came to visit the Initiative to Study Hate was that one of the most understudied, surprisingly, just historically speaking, topics is the intersection of misogyny and white supremacy. And something you said, Bethan, made me think about, um, how people are drawn in, and they're not going to be necessarily drawn in with like explicitly hateful messages, but the way that particularly vulnerable, especially young boys, are kind of targeted in terms of like, just searching and like searching something on the internet, like why do women reject me, or like why am I so lonely, or whatever. And then like the way that just that feeling of like isolation or feelings of perceived emasculation can get like targeted by these groups. And so and I think one of the things that's fascinating is the way in which like white supremacy and just kind of hate groups in general, like the landscape is really shifting so that we see even like men of color participating in like white supremacy. Or I know Mukesh, you've talked about in your research, like Muslim fans of H-pop, for example, or people who are fans of music or even a group and following that would seem antithetical to their own best interests. So I was wondering if any of you could kind of speak to that, the sort of changing landscape of white supremacy, and then how that's playing out in regards to music.
Okay, I can go first if I think I came across people who were working for the H-pop music in part of producing because it's their job. I think a lot of time people who produce H-pop are not necessarily exclusively H-pop. They are like small recording studio. They say we don't care what kind of material it is, and they say we listen to it. And second, when it comes to consumption, it is really important when when this music is, especially in India, and I'm mostly focused on the public consumption of music, not the private consumption. In public consumption of new music, a lot of them you don't have a choice. If you're working in a market, in a store, and this all time there's vehicles coming, going in, someone in the store playing loud music in India, which is quite common. It would be like very common that people play music all through the day. You might get used to it. So consumption also very passive consumption here. I think a lot of time that's which is very, because that's a big part, because for the initiator who might not necessarily go out and look for that particular music can get hooked to it while passive listening, right? Get used to it. They might not necessarily think very consciously I like it or don't like it, or I want to listen to it, not listen to it. Just because it's such a part of a soundscape, wherever you go out in market, at home, in street, in religion, festival, in even weddings, these songs are played. Because if something is kind of viral or popular, those songs then get played everywhere. So that's where I think the passive consumption is quite high in these cases. So that is, I think, one thing. And second, about gender, when I was interviewing people about my podcast, and a lot of people came and said like, there's always been sexist song in India, like very explicitly sexist song. There's a longer history of casteist song, and people against the marginalized caste, like they've been mocked or like looked down upon in songs. And people ask why there is so much cry about Hindutva pop now. It's not that the music before was kind of sensitive or respectful to people. So then, but as you said, like the sexist song and then H-pop, again there's a large constituency which is common to both, like male, Hindu male, or I would say people would like to, this I think would say a lot of I think commonality between these two constituency. And I think again all comes from that same, when we keep studying in academic, like I mean, when you have a sense of superiority, then you might have a sense of superiority on 5 grounds, not only on one. It could be race, okay. A white supremacist might not necessarily just be supremacist when it comes to race. It will be come about command our language, the class, the place, the locality, neighborhood they live, the kind of jobs they take up. Because it's a kind of a rabbit hole. Once you go into this idea of I am better than the other, then you will find 100,000 reasons to find that. And then you kind of subscribe to all of these in one capacity. Of course, your driving force might be one, but you would be dragged away all along on all fronts, thinking, okay, I'm better in so many ways, not only just my race or just my caste. Look at me, like So I think because that's why they say otherization, if once it takes root in you, then all kind of otherization will come. And I think that because gender is such a big category, like if we go into this system, like the division of gender are like numerous, but again broadly in society like India, I mean, it again mostly work on binary. So you have half a constituency being kind of, brought down through music because the other half enjoy it.
Right.
And then the second in India would be like religion because of the political climate towards a certain kind of political, like Hindu nationalism. Then Muslim become an easy target. And lot of time in a very decentralized way because the caste is an important factor in India, and there's a lot of caste violence, and music has been casteist for a long time, even today, if you go and see. But because there's a very concerted effort to of Hindu nationalism to kind of uh, highlight the Hindu Muslim binary than the caste, because caste is basically dividing them. So they want to really put it under the carpet, the caste divide, and come across together. That's where Hindutva bind them against the other, which is Muslim. But I think it's just a matter of time. Those undercurrents, what is being swept under the carpet, would come out again, and it keeps coming back time and again. I mean, it would be very difficult. You say, "Oh, I would be just anti-Muslim, and rest I would be perfect." No, it is impossible. Like,
Right.
it would be like white supremacist, but I would be respectful to other. No, it won't happen.
Right. Right. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that fascinates people is this idea of the inclusion of non-white peoples into sort of what are commonly considered white supremacist or white nationalist groups. I think it's important to not overly homogenize hate movements, and also to not just see the inclusion of non-white people as sort of tokenism, right? That can be the case in certain hate groups. I'm not saying that it's not, and it certainly plays to the defense, let's say, of certain hateful movements when they can point to a person in their ranks who the mainstream or legacy media says that they are alienating. But I think that even within white supremacist circles, that term supremacist often gets kind of not fully understood. So white supremacists will say things such as, well, I think the white race is inherently superior, but I don't necessarily think that all non-white peoples should not exist or should be killed, or this concept of like remigration. If everybody just went back to racially homogenized societies, then everything would be fine. So I think that there are discussions such as that, which is white supremacists will say, like, I got no problems with, just because Mukesh was talking about India, like if all Indian people went back to India, Pakistani people went back to Pakistan, but I like don't want them in my white country, or I don't want them intermarrying, or Muslims should go to Muslim countries, whatever that might mean in their worldview. They all say like that concept of supreme doesn't necessarily mean that they believe in like eradication. They believe in like separation, let's say, or there will be other groups that will be focused more on concepts of like Western, or you have the Proud Boys who will say like they support Western chauvinism. So again, like in that, there's lots of structures. And so you will have members of the Proud Boys who are non-white. So they will push back very vehemently about being described as like a white supremacist or a white nationalist group, because they will say it's not about race, it's about like culture or society, about who is the other and who is the threat to society. So I have seen often in hate groups that I study, many, I would say a large majority of this kind of foot soldiers, let's say, might be classified as white supremacist or white nationalist. But technically on an organizational level, the inciting factors like Islamophobia, or is Islamophobia and like homophobia at the same time, transphobia, they will say they will perhaps be more tolerant of including non-white peoples, as long as those non-white peoples in their movement know their place, which is like kind of a only ever going to be a foot soldier, only ever going to be kind of a second class citizen, even within the movement, let alone within like their ideal society. But what I find fascinating is the non-white individuals who incorporate in groups that are sort of synonymous with promoting white supremacy. Like, why might they do that? What might come there? I was in Singapore recently, and in Singapore, there was that discussion of perpetrators of or planning to perpetrate acts of violence, and the inciting ideology therein had to do with Islamophobia and hatred of Muslim immigrants in particular, if my memory serves. And so even though this person was also not white, they had spent a lot of time in white supremacist online spaces because they saw their Islamophobic rhetoric matched with that being said in these white supremacist spaces. So they kind of compartmentalized the other racist things that were going on because they said the thing that incites me also incites those in this group, and thus I can like put aside these other aspects of what they're saying because I would like to be a consumer of the Islamophobic content they put out, let's say. So it's like a very fascinating element therein, which again speaks to the kind of emotional level at which people are operating. Like, I think it's really important to state that individuals who engage in hate are like us in the way, like every other person. They are motivated not always by rational thought, and they are motivated by emotions and experiences and fears. And they can make all kinds of decisions in their political and personal lives that totally work against their best interest. People do that all of the time. And it is confusing from an outsider perspective, but that's not to say that individuals who are non-white and join these groups or support parts of their messages are so different and aberrant in their thinking. We see many people who vote against, speak against what is ultimately might be considered their best interest. And they're doing that because they're motivated by things like fear, emotion, experience, negative experiences, let's say. So I think it's really important to acknowledge and hold that up. And I think that's part of the research that I try to do, or part of the purpose of my research, is to say, like, there are so many ways that people get sucked into this. Music is one of them. Fear, the emotion component therein. It's kind of a little bit like a cult. People always say, like, I'd never join a cult. And actually, many cult experts, for whatever you want to say about them, will be like, that makes you actually very vulnerable, because if you think that you know better, you actually don't know all the ways in which you're being like influenced perhaps to join these movements. But so I think those are important things. I also just want to add, there's also some music that I look at, the lion's share that I would say, that is unmistakably exceptionally graphic, exceptionally difficult. It's not implicit. It's like hardcore, hateful, on its face, like really intense. But at the same time, like, people will listen to that even if they're not yet members of that movement, because they want to consume content that speaks to their level of angst, or that sounds really good when they're running, because they want a beat that like keeps pace to them. There's a whole bunch of people who do that again in mainstream. And so I think it's not always even that like the musical messages are covert, but it can be really overt. But people just want to listen to screamo music because they're having a bad day, so they go online, they Google something, they find it, and there you go. And I think much the same way that mainstream like consumers of art have had these questions as well, like, can you separate artists from music, or like art from their art, artists from their art? People, when they're maybe first encountering even really hardcore screamo-y, I hate, insert any number of communities there, might be of the vein like many others, like, I think I can separate, let's say, like Mukesh kind of mentioned, can separate the two because I just want to listen to someone scream for a while, and I won't do it again, I promise. And there's no expert. But I think that I don't want to confuse, when I anyone who is listening to this to say that like how much of hate music in the white supremacist scene is covert or implicit. It's almost
Hmm.
exclusively really intense and like really overt. People don't just like hear one hate slur every so often, and that's it. There's not as much nuance going on there, but there is still enough to think about like what are the emotional hooks that get people sucked in, the psychological, is it around them because they were introduced to it by their parents, or did they like not quite catch what the lyric was the first time, or whatever it is. So it's complicated, but like please don't assume that like a lot of white supremacist hate music is not really graphic. It's really not.
So I know,
Catherine and yeah, sorry, Catherine and then Mukesh.
yeah, I just wanted to kind of like, yeah, exactly, Bethan, for setting that up, but focusing on like that non-white people aspect, but also that separation between the artist and his music. And a key figure that I've really been thinking about right now is sort of an exemplifies just this bigger question has been, I think, Kanye West, just in the music industry. And I think very much so it is talking about West is very difficult. And he's a figure who exists at this sort of nexus of an enormous cultural influence, and he has been for a very, very long time. He has deep personal volatility, but he's come out with these hugely anti-Semitic statements in the last few years, and very much recently. His also that sort of memorabilia that he's putting out with the Nazi, just very clear Nazi imagery as well. And so when he says things like "I love Hitler," it's not just a shocking soundbite. It's literally like he's inciting hate in that capacity, I think. And so you can't separate his music, I think, arguably, from what he's saying in this capacity. But I think the way that people are then responding to him really highlights what we're seeing and we're talking about here, because then it's white people are then saying like, oh, see, it's not just us that are anti-Semitic, that it's not disingenuous, it's isolating a sort of anti-Semitism as an individual flaw instead of like a larger systemic problem in that aspect. And I also think, though, what he's doing with his music really pushes it into a realm that we're not really fully considering in a way, because when he started to say these things is also when he started to shift towards this kind of Christian aspect in his music. And for me, I think that kind of reflects a sort of ancient Jew hatred in a sense, and it's kind of positioning it in this like in the GOP more like evangelicalized Christian attitude. And like his Jesus Walks track really pushed those Christian themes into the mainstream hip hop in a way that felt extremely, extremely radical. And it reinforced the idea that what Kanye had to say was really, really meaningful to that conservative public. Um, and so I think in that aspect, we certainly cannot separate what he is saying in his music, even though his music might not be explicitly saying, Hitler is wonderful, DEFCON to the Jews, the other things that he's saying on his social media. The music and the social media, those might be separate, but they're definitely intertwined. And I think we really, really need to consider those seriously. So, it's just an ecosystem, as we're all talking about, that they are intertwined, and maybe we can't like fully map it out directly, but it is all existing together and manifesting this hate in a broader scale.
Just say that also there's a lot of discussion online about whether or not some of specific to Ye, but this is true in other contexts as well, right? The fact that like outrage culture is such a thing that if you say something outrageous, people will go look at your content and then they could be like, surprise, I have an album dropping in this amount of time, or I am like a featured whatever on this next track, or I'm collabing with this other artist. So I remember initially in one of the waves in which Ye was engaging in this, there were young people online who were like, this is just him sort of rage baiting his way into like soft launching an album, which for people who care about the cultural climate are like, this is not okay, and like making it to the expense of other people is dangerous. But I think that it's also important that in many cases, and I'd be curious if Mukesh, this is true in your contexts that you look at, like if there is actually an incitement of hate or like rage bait, so that then very soon after you can like pivot to be like, well, here, come sell my, now that your eyes are on me, even for like bad press or whatever, I will get invited to interviews where I'll get paid, or I can like pitch my next upcoming project, which people will feel like they have to consume in order to continue to be part of the like outrage conversation. So I just wanted to highlight that. Sorry, I jumped in again.
Yeah, no, and also just to say though, like I got on when he was selling his most recent website. I got on when it was on there, and then on Reddit when it got shut down. And just the amount of users who were just so pissed off that they didn't have time to buy the product, and just the amount of nasty, awful commentary that was coming out in support that they really, really wanted it to. So I think he is very much causing this huge hateful following as well too. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I wanted to continue with Bethan's point. I think, the whole idea of that people who are consuming this music, like, the non-white people part of the white supremacist movement, and in India, a lot of people who are marginalized being part of the Hindu nationalist movement. These people are like, these are the people with agencies. They are making very, very calculated choice a lot of time. And as I said earlier, a lot of time their associations are strategic, right? So they might be associated with them because they might get benefits out of it. And that could be, being close to political power, feel safe and empowered on street, in public, right? Having might some economic incentives, right? Good social network. Someone who coming from marginalized class or caste can break into those power network and then can make something out of it. Business people or from people who are in first second generation family business or in education, they go to university, those network might be a support system for them. So there are a lot of these things come up, and I think because of this in very aggressive, very charged atmosphere, a lot of time these movement also have strategic silences about things. They might be sexist, or they might be anti anti other groups like marginalized caste, let's say anti-Dalit, but at particular point of time they might tone down those rhetoric or be silent on them to draw more people. So lot of time these, in a longer history, these things matter because at some point they say, okay, we want to be anti-Muslim at the moment or sexist at that moment. Other rhetoric might go down. These are the strategic, I think, silence and the vocalization. And the second, I think, the whole point of a lot of time, these movements are not just anti something. These are also the movement where there's certain kind of self-fashioning happening with white supremacist movement, how we're supposed to behave. What are the things that you're supposed to do? So the lot of self-fashioning is also happening in this process. So for that matter, there's a lot of debate about when this kind of violence happens, that why would Hindu nationalists or these people would go in front of a mosque to play Hindu religious music, even if it's not hateful music. What is the site of Hindu religiosity? Is it mosque or temple? Right? And a lot of people would ask, like I think some religious Hindu religious guru say, if you are religious, so if you are Hindu, why would you go in front of a mosque and dance or play the music? He say there are less and less people coming to temples than going in front of mosque and dancing. So it's also fashioning of what a Hindu mean in contemporary time. Is it going to a temple shrine worshipping or observing those idea of purity, impurity, or is it now dancing in front of a mosque or being anti-Muslim or being out and aggressive all the time? Even in your religious traditional spaces of music where it's supposed to be more pleasant, peaceful, philosophical, reflective, when having this music, what is this new Hindu this undermaking, especially when it comes to auditory sense, identity? So I think it's more about this is a lot about the other who they're against, but it's also a lot of self-fashioning. And I think we need to engage with the self-fashioning part because that's where, because homogenization is happening, it's an internal process as well. so that
Mm.
their idea could be find more fertile ground in a homogeneous crowd. I think that would be my point ahead.
Yeah, I think that that's a really interesting, point along the lines of thinking like what are people getting out of it? What are the sort of, I don't want to say positive things that people are getting from it, right? But I think that the more practical piece that several of you are bringing up, like what do people get out of this, like on a purely monetary level, and then also Beth, into your point about like and Mukesh as well, like some movements will make certain things more subtle at first, so as to attract others into a movement. And yeah, sorry, Beth, and yeah, I saw you had your hand.
I think it's really important to recognize that, like, what 5 years or 6 years when we were talking about like all these young boys who were being recruited into the movement during the pandemic, let's say they were teenage boys then, they're like maturing and reaching adulthood now, potentially having children already, or in the future having children. And so this is not like white supremacist movements is not, especially the very extreme forms. It's not just a bunch of like crusty old men like talking into a message board, but actually it's a lot of very young people who are being encouraged explicitly and implicitly to like have as many children, white children, as possible. One of the other things aside from the trad wife thing is now with the advent of like AI, the number of like AI images of white women in like different traditional white country like custom clothing. So it's like, look at this like AI version of a white lady from Lithuania and from Estonia. And it's like all these like pastoral pictures of women with children and flowers in their hair. And it looks very tranquil and calm, and makes, I think probably, I've never been a teenage boy, but probably appeals to a teenage boy's desire to be accepted and to like find a partner and have children. And so I think that that's going on. And with all of that messaging bombarding a population that is sort of growing into childbearing years, we are seeing this move to have lots of children. And these people are not de-radicalizing. And so they are, in fact, still consuming really hardcore content. And they're not always going to expose their kids to like screamo, really intense music. So, but at the same time, they would still want their children to be raised to believe the same things that they do politically. And so the question becomes, there is this like vacuum, which some are stepping into, of producing content for these explicitly white supremacist families that are growing in size. So we're seeing, for instance, like white supremacist book publishers are coming out with all kinds of new books that have that explicit message. But music is one of the really important other ways that children are being drawn in to this movement or introduced to this, because their parents will play like nursery rhymes that have white supremacist messaging in the way that is like basically tells the story of how dangerous it is to mix with people who don't look like you, or the importance of like only worshiping a Christian God or a paganism as well. So like there are some where Christianity is decried. But these are like nursery rhymes where they'll have like, instead of A is for apple, B is for boy, it'll be like A is for Aryan, B is for like whatever. So they have versions of that which are designed for children who are not critical readers. Music is one of them, again. And also like that doesn't just go for when the child is a baby, but we have seen for those who study the white supremacist or white power music scene, there will be like a festival. And I mean festival, I mean it looks in many ways just like a festival in the mainstream, except that the bands are like hardcore hateful, and we'll see a lot more swastikas or hate-based material there. But like in many ways, the bones of it are the same, or the dynamics of how they're run. But they'll have like a hardcore hate day, which is mostly for like adult men, sometimes for their partners as well. But they will not infrequently also have like a child and family day the day before or in the morning for families to go there. and like introduce, they'll even sometimes have children who will be performing at those events so that children can see themselves as participating in the movement and like consuming the content of other children. There's like a famous couple from the 90s, and they've grown up to de-radicalize the two performing women. But like there are these mechanisms by which music as kind of a educational tool, but also as just like a tool of enjoyment, like any children, like we sing to our children in the mainstream as well. There is music being created that is not necessarily going to be like talking about slitting someone's throat, which is what you might most extreme examples, but will be teaching the same messaging around like, don't talk to people who don't look like you. I can't wait for you to fall in love with I'm going to fall in love with a white man and produce white babies in the future, or like the dangers of society. So those are the same messages. They're just like aged down slightly.
Right.
And I'm really fascinated to see obviously, I don't hope it thrives at all, but I'm fascinated as a researcher to see what the white supremacist space will have to do as more of its members are exiting teenage years and entering child rearing years, and like what they will produce for their next generations, because there is such attention on
Right.
for white children.
Right. Thank you, Beth. And I know that within white supremacism, sort of classical music and the idea of like high art and like high civilization music is quite prevalent. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I think if we tie it back to Nazi Germany, this idea of high art, it was definitely the highest form, right? They very much focused on this, very much tied it into this notion of purity that, Mukesh brought this up at the very beginning. Like at the core of any sort of right-wing politics is this purity concept of something. And so the Nazis very much highlighted, we always think like Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, but Mozart as well, just anything very much that highlighted this sort of Germanist, this nature, but it was these very explicit classical musical forms, and it removed any sort of the music, the Jewish music, those were banned completely, which is actually quite sad because there's a lot of Jewish classical composers like Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, which is also kind of an ironic comparison because he did change his name to Bartholdy, and it was only after post-war that they reattached Mendelssohn to it, which is the Jewish name. So you see kind of dynamics within that. But this concept of high art very much was the very essence of Nazism. But kind of tying it to this present moment in time and just this conversation that was happening and taking it back to the Super Bowl, I was thinking, what kind of halftime show would have been acceptable? And if we were to kind of pinpoint like high art right now, I don't really know what that would be in America actually, because I honestly, like when we're looking at the inauguration, there wasn't really a particular type of music that was performed, and the individuals, like there were key individuals that were highlighted, but there was this range of types of music that were presented. And so I think that there's this, there is this change in what is going on now versus what happened then, and what, shifting from the kind of like ideology to what is it now. If I'm sort of making sense. But I think at the inauguration, Carrie Underwood sang, and she was attacked for that, country music. But, we wouldn't swap out her for Taylor Swift because Trump hated Taylor Swift because of his endorsement of Kamala Harris. And so there's this distinction here, which I think in America right now, like high art, what would that be? I don't know. I think people would say probably Taylor Swift or something like that. So it's completely different in the sort of what we're having going on in Nazi Germany versus now, but there's still the same kind of political undertones with it that is highlighting this too.
I mean, I think to your point, Catherine, though, about like the question of what would have been an acceptable alternative, the purpose that I would find in the sort of most extreme circles in which my work takes me is the concept that like the Jews as a monolith like control music and media and thus have stunted the ability of what would be great like traditional white usually it's Christian, like artists from coming to the fore. So the fact that you couldn't name like what is high American art in their definition, they actually would use as like a confirmation of their own conspiratorial thinking, which is that like they the big amorphous cabal that of a or of they would not allow for that kind of high art to be produced because it couldn't be manipulated. But the versions that I see sort of venerated, for lack of a better term, that are not the traditional. So again, the same kind of composer elements would be like folk music, which again is a failure to recognize the like contributions of many non-white people in the creation of these kinds of pieces of folk music. But that would be one component therein. And there's like an interesting additional layer to that, which is like a class element, which is like, look, the music that we want to go back to, not only is it largely drawn from like rural environments, it's also drawn from like working communities. So it's a lot of discussion around like, we don't want to have like all this pop techno music. We want people on fiddles and recorders and harps. Strong emphasis again on like performative femininity. So like female vocalists, very traditionally dressed. There's some interest in like male vocal choirs because certain European countries have like male vocal choirs as a quite large element of their culture. But it's a lot of like folk music, cultural like heritage music from like a certain demographic or ethnic community that they view as under threat now. And I think that's true in the United States, but also in other countries as well. So like throughout Europe, inclusive of like white communities in South Africa, in Australasia, you see that as well. So whether or not they actually consume this music, I find really interesting, as opposed to like listening to 4 seconds that like shows up when they see like a female harpist in a meadow somewhere and they're like, oh, this is what music should be like, or a fiddle player or like a flautist is another question. But I think that that's kind of the element that goes into it. I think that the only other thing I might mention as like music that gets kind of venerated is like marching songs, not marching bands, but like old school, like militaristic sounding music, or music that was like used in warfare, are like other things that they don't even necessarily have to have lyrics. But again, right, some people want to listen to music when they run or train, and so they're like not necessarily looking for the lyrics to be politicized, but they also just want to know that the music that they're listening to has like a tradition or has like history behind it. Again, it's very whitewashing, and I don't agree with their assessment of like any of these things, obviously, but even their concept of like what is folk whitewashes particularly like immense amount of immigrant and non-white.
And I will just like add one comment to this. I think there are several factors to it. One, of course, is like the streaming concept that we have. You know, the music is so accessible now. So there's not just like in Nazi Germany, you had what you had and you had the radio, and it was so much easier to say like, we're listening to this now and we're listening to this now. And so you have a larger demographic. But I also think what you're talking about, Bethan, like really highlights the sort of disparate trends that we've seen developing in America, and also this like the larger polarization too at the same time in the elections and everything that's manifesting here. But when you're talking about the folk thing too, just to kind of tie it back to one element, one of the really hateful TikToks that I saw about the halftime show, like redid one of them and said, "There, I fixed it," and it was like a remake in a folk tradition form, which was very, very weird. But there was something about it that they wanted to take it and say, like, this is ours that we need to fix, and they presented it in a musical form that they thought was better.
And so I would have assumed that it would be something like minstrel work, where you could, in theory, have like an intersection of politics, race, and I not that any of that would be right, but I had figured in my head that a version of fixing it, just from like other tweets that I had seen or messages, would have been like, well, it's okay for Black performance that serves a certain function for white consumption if it fits into like a characterized definition of.
Well, and I think that this was like the most hateful one I saw. And I saw other versions like dubs fix it in like a funny way or something like that. But this one was really not well done. So
I want to have one more question for everyone. And it helps to kind of like tie in a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of the kind of not just like the insidiousness of like how hate can be perpetuated through music, but also like what motivates people into not only listening to hateful music, but hateful movements. And there has been a lot of research done on music and emotion, and on how music that incorporates like certain harmonies or tempos or instrumentation brings about positive emotion, and how it helps to calm the heart rate. And I'm wondering if all of you could maybe speak to this, like what is it about like music in particular, calming music, that ironically can make it more effective in recruiting people into hate movements, or even in preparing people to engage in heinous acts of violence.
One thing I just wanted to add to this conversation too is just to think about hate as an emotion. And we've talked about this a lot in our initiative, but like hate just as that is severely understudied, and something that's central to hate is something that it very much pervades for a very lasting amount of time. And at its core, hate is also very often understood or replaced by another emotion. And so oftentimes something that might be very, very hateful, individuals might not perceive themselves as an act of hate. So what they are doing, maybe they just think as like anger, but it might not even be anger. If we're thinking of like the MAGA movement right now and the huge Christian following that they have. And if you go to, I've viewed some evangelical services when they are talking about support for a lot of the really horrible things that we have seen unfold in the past few months. And then it is followed by these like really nice, beautiful Christian songs of love and the kind of calming aspects that you're highlighting here. And so that to me is that's not aligning at all. And so I think that there is that huge disconnect there, that they're just not identifying what that hate is as actual hate. They really truly think that what they are doing is good. And maybe, to us, we see it as hateful. To them, they think that it is right. So that there's that societal disconnect in itself. But just hate overall, I think, is just it's not understood on that kind of broader scale. And as we've highlighted throughout this entire conversation, it does not always manifest as rage and ire and anger. It can very much manifest in very subtle ways. And I think we're seeing that very drastically right now.
I think music resonates well with people because, like, specific context of India, I mean, this is a popular culture and music is being kind of mass produced and listened like a lot of places. So I think first is accessible. When it comes to hate and music, I think there are a couple of points I would like to make. One is the chaotic world that we are living in last few years. It's like, really seems like falling apart, COVID, pandemic, war, and everything. I think there's a sense of lack of community, and people are looking for community. And music actually become one of the factor that binds them together. And also, I think it's also the question of value system. Now certain kind of value system become accepted at some point of time. There were always people who believed in this kind of ideology, supremacist ideology. But why they comes out? There's a accepted value system. Oh, it's okay now. It's accepted to do that. And the second, I think it's also important the law or the we call the political or the power, right? The legitimacy. Now, the people feel that it's okay to go out and say it, espouse it, commit it, because the power is kind of on that side. So I mean, because as a human being, we always had all kinds of emotion. The fact when we choose to act on it, and then when someone act on it, what happens to them also decide how many people will act on it. If there is an impunity, then lot more people will commit to it, because that's an easy kind of lenting out your prejudice, but also their frustration with the things that is not related to that person. Like largely you are lonely, you have no one likes you, you have no jobs, and there are a lot of like complex issue in particular is. So I think because of the digital environment, the access become much more easier. There are
Mm,
instances of people kind of indulging in those emotional states and then sometime acting on that, I think.
mm,
And I think broadly music is kind of very influential medium. It kind of really gets you, and how you, and I think as Catherine said something very, very important, like these things we are talking about hidden music, but these are packaged in a larger broad phenomena, and a lot of things are people genuinely believe they are doing for good, for their community, for their people, for their religion, for the larger humanity. I mean, people would commit to these things because we are looking in the small parts of hate. Because a lot of people just looking broadly, they would say, okay, if this person of this institution or of this body is saying something, that must be good, because belief is at the end of the day believing that that this is pious, this is there is a sanctity to this. So if they say something, we should listen to them. So I think that's where this whole idea of faith and belief, especially when we think of because my work is on the intersection of religion, not questioning everything is part of the system, because in religion you don't question necessarily everything. It is the
mm,
obedience
mm,
that makes it different, and that lot of time when we think logically, and it's faith, and a lot of time they are driven wrongly, but this is what it is.
mm. I completely agree, Mukesh, and it's interesting just to return again to Kathleen Blee, the sociologist I mentioned earlier, because another thing that she talks a lot about is how um, what drives so many people into extremist movements in general is actually a desire for community, a desire for a positive emotional experience that offsets a negative one, which is loneliness. And we know that we are experiencing a loneliness crisis around the world, in part, perpetuated by increasing income inequality, especially in the Western context. In the U.S. context, it's becoming out of control, as you mentioned, with more and more adults living with their aging parents, which was considered really something that was against the American dream and completely anti-aspirational at one point, right? So you have a lot of people who are feeling like lonely and like they're losers, especially men, I think that that is something that we need to listen to if we really want to address hate, is like what is, the one of the factors driving people into maybe not even extremist movements, but into self-harm, into also um, just other sort of, domestic violence, and what is this like loneliness crisis, and how can we address it? Um, and um, I think we're out of time to get into anti-hate mitigation strategies, but that I think we can end on this in in a nice way of thinking about maybe a part two where we could come together and talk about sort of how to implement, I guess, compassion and kindness and as a sort of anti-hate mitigation intervention. But I want to just give everybody just one last chance to end with a closing thought or statement.
I'll go first, I guess. So I did wanted to just bring it back, and we're talking about participation and community. And as you know, my work really centers on World War II Holocaust memory, and we saw just a horrible way of how community was used in that capacity. And the following there, Thomas Torino has a really wonderful book called Music as Social Life, where he compares that movement to the civil rights movement, which we saw music used very, very wonderfully. They used it in support and community, and it was used very successfully and positive in that manner. And so in the exact same kind of way that it was used in the Nazi movement as well, just singing, coming together as a community. So I think we just need to kind of keep that in mind, that the same kind of methods that are being used to manifest these hateful techniques, we can spin them around and use them for positive as well. It's the same thing on social media. The way that you underscore a video, you can use it in a positive way too. So we just need to think about rewiring our mind and really being intentional about every action that we are doing, and just really listening to our surrounding areas. And that's really every time that I offer up to people, is that literally the world is sounding too, and we really need to actively engage in it and be present, and just listen. So
Thank you, Catherine.
I think that for me, music is a really helpful way of returning to the fundamental concept that I hold, which is that, like, even in the most extreme of cases, the people who engage in hate, who have fallen victim to hate and then victimize others with it, they are feeling the same human experiences, the emotional experience when they listen to music. It might not be the music I would choose, certainly isn't the music I would choose to listen to. Its messages are not what I would want, but they have an emotional response to the music that they love in the same way that I do. They are moved by things similar to myself. It's very important to me that we, as a society, we as researchers, don't lose sight of the fact that, like, an individual does not set out, even when they start their political education, to like engage in hate almost ever. Like the vast majority of individuals who are part of movements that perpetuate all kinds of atrocious ideas and activities are still humans as they're doing this, and in many cases still view themselves as doing the right thing, engaging in the right actions. And so when you humanize those individuals, you are able to understand to a certain extent what they're doing and what motivates them. And that's an important part, to my mind, of helping to mitigate the harms that they do, to actually save them from themselves in their sort of entrenchedness in hate, but also is really important in cutting across the recruitment procedure, the processes that go on for the next generations. Like, if we assume that every person engaged in a hate movement is a monster who doesn't think like us, who doesn't have emotions like us, then it'll be really hard to prevent more people from falling into those traps. But if we can look at something like, they have a favorite song too, or they listened to the same song that I did, but they came out of it with a different message, or whatever it is, if you see that shared human component, I think that is really essential. And so for me, music is really interesting in many ways around, like, how people make money, how people see themselves, see the other. But also, fundamentally, we should look at their love of music, like our love of music, helps create a bond and a shared mentality that we can thus tap into and try to help fight better.
I think I would say, I think one thing for sure that music, I think, is a very creative medium, and that I think it's a good thing that a lot of people are actually engaged with music. When we think of like hate and music, I think a lot of time the sense of loneliness, the lack of community, as I think as Bethan said, we need to look at these people as a human being. I think a lot of time it is our social systems, and I think largely the value system that we adhere to. I think it is a kind of influx happening there. So I think there has to be, this kind of act has to be de-incentivized in a way, like, I'm not talking in terms of legality, but in terms of as a social value system. And of course there are a lot of interesting, exciting, anti-hate work or pro-love or pro-harmony, solidarity work is happening in music in India, especially that there are musicians who are working on traditional devotional music are coming up together, and they are actually making constitutional song about civil rights, fundamental rights. And of course there's a lot of resistance towards these homogenizing forces, like, in counter to h-pop, in the same beat, same kind of music is also coming pro people music, like, anti-caste music coming in the same beats. So there are always alternatives. The idea is basically how we can amplify those alternatives. And I think, as we all, I think, is discussed here, these are the part of the larger global movement. You can't trace it to one particular country or region or one kind of society. I think when the wave kind of, it's on a high tide right now, when I think before it goes down, I think we have to, a lot of us actually have to hold it fast. And I think there are people who are working to amplify. As a researcher, we can amplify, work with them, you know, to keep the hope visible. Actually, that's the most important, I think, task. And I think there are a lot of people I'm working in India on that, and other parts of the world as well. But one, I think, thing I think would say that this is a larger system and music is part of it. And music in itself has a capacity, as it has shown in the past, but in itself music could not do much actually on itself. So I think there are the larger forces, and music could actually contribute to it, in that is that historically contributed a lot of pro people, anti-war movement and all. And I think there might be something that may come up pretty soon, or hopefully very soon in the future, that we might not see around at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that if we can harness it toward good, I think, and it makes me think about a lot of research that's done on like the power of music to heal, or not necessarily heal, but to be this very calming force for Alzheimer's patients, and how music is the one thing that can sort of bring back memories for people who have completely lost all other sense of memory. And I wonder if we apply that same sort of physiological approach to healing in music to a sort of sociological approach to healing in music, what the possibilities might be. So with that, I just want to say thank you, everyone. I feel like the four of us could talk for like hours on this. So I just realized,
I think we just did.
Yeah, we did. We can keep going. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your incredible insight into this topic, and I'd love to keep the conversation going, like I said. So thanks everyone, and have a wonderful evening. And especially thank you to Mukesh. I know it's probably really late where you are, so thank you.
It's great conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. This was wonderful. And Amalia, thank you for putting it together.
Of course. Thank you.